Thanks very much for the invitation to present today. My internal monologue for talks like this are pretty well scripted, and I did not let myself down. Starts with a yes, and then it quickly moves to a what was I thinking. But I also tend to pop out on the other side feeling grateful for the chance to reflect and connect some of the dots. That's only really possible when someone poses a question like Furman has. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land also, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to express my gratitude for their generosity as they continue to care for country. The closest analogy I think that I can use to describe my relationship with architecture and its impact on my identity would be to say that it's approximate to being driven in a car, driven at speed with great intention toward a completely unknown destination. And until relatively recently, a feeling of never really being in quite the right place, a kind of restlessness. And I think that's partly because I started with the narrowest of definitions when I decided that I'd study architecture, and that was that I wanted to design houses. And over time, I've come to disconnect from the object of architecture and think more about practice as being a service that is provided. And it's true that on the one hand, I am doing what I enrolled in at 17. I'm an architect, but I think at 53, it does speak volumes about the breadth of the profession that I'm still practicing architecture in a way, but it's completely different than how I arrived at my studies. So I wanted to make sense of this by talking about some interconnected ideas, and some of them are, actually, there's a lot of crossover between Abby and I, but you'll see that. The first is around imprints and impressions, and then impatience and influence, and lastly, incrementalism and also invisibility. So my father was not a WA native. Actually, he was born in Sydney, and he moved to Melbourne and he studied forestry at Melbourne Uni, where he was the president of the Mountaineering Club. And this is him climbing. Oh no, that's not, oh yeah, he is there. I'm looking at two slides. That's him climbing the north face of Wilson Hall, which I've never shown my children because I don't want them to get dangerous ideas. And he came to WA as a graduate, and he was based in an absolutely tiny country town, and he'd head out into the bush and record the age of trees and their health in the old growth jarrah forests. Meanwhile, my grandmother in a neighbouring town offered a rather selfless gesture of hosting young gentlemen who were either at the ag school or at the forestry working and living in these little huts. They'd come over for weekly meals, but it was actually a highly successful form of matchmaking, with my mother marrying my father and two of my aunts marrying ag school students. My father was a lifelong learner. He, as I said, he studied at Melbourne Uni. He then did a master's in his... he went to the US and did a master's before marrying my mum. And then he did another one in his 40s. And at 80, he gained a PhD. My mother had a very different background. She grew up on a dairy farm in a small town, and she absolutely could not wait to get out of there. At 22, she headed off to London by boat, where she worked for a couple of years before returning to Perth. And she's a potent combination of being refined and very well mannered, with the capacity to swear like a trooper at a moment at the most unexpected of times. She's feisty, and in my teenage years, she caused me so much embarrassment. She was continually campaigning around issues that just weren't right. It's nuclear disarmament, no more war toys, xylene in Artline pens, and a tree being removed on the neighbouring block. And at one stage she came up with a placard on a broomstick, which was good for everything, and it said, "No more naughty business." And actually I think I often reflect that this as each thing arrives, this would be the perfect statement to be travelling with. So my childhood was spent camping a lot with my dad and my brother. He loved camping and travelling around the southwest. He would take us climbing up Bluff Knoll. He would get us collecting Banksias, undertaking some kind of study. Probably he claimed it as a work trip. In the later 70s, my parents actually separated and my mum repartnered, and I shifted from being an oldest child to the youngest, not the youngest, the fifth out of six. People struggle to understand this, so listen up. I became the fifth out of six, and then my stepfather and mother had two more children, so I became the fifth out of eight. So there were 8. So that's that photo there. That's 8 of us with our aunt and uncle from Melbourne. And the imprints of my family in the space between nature and nurture isn't actually that clear. I went to my father's every weekend, but in both family contexts, education, an inquiring mind, standing up for what is right, and a quick wit were highly valued. In both, culture and the arts were more dominant than sports, and there was constantly a pull between a kind of cultured life and the richness of the natural world. To accommodate this huge family that I just described, my mother and stepfather engaged the late Brian Clopper to do a huge addition to an already huge Federation home in Claremont, which is in the western suburbs, which here translates to the eastern suburbs. So just got the picture. This is not our house, this is another house designed by Brian. But he made a huge impression on me. He was tall, scruffy, handsome, he was straight talking, and he had to duck slightly underneath doorways, and he was also a builder, so he had Blundstones before they were a thing. And he felt a little bit more country than city, and I just thought he was really awesome. When it was time to make a choice around study, and my mum was pretty clear that I needed to get an education so that I could support myself and maybe my children if I had to, architecture felt like a good way to combine my love of art with something that made me a professional, and that was quite a big thing in our family. It turns out when I got to uni that Brian Clopper was all the rage, but because I was trying to shake off my reputation as a private schoolgirl, because I didn't go to UWA where Abby went, I went to Curtin where all the public school kids went, I was nervous about fessing up about this house, so I kept that to myself for as long as I could. However, my mate, we had these like little cubes where you had 4 desks inside these studios, and my friend Reno Marsala, this was his house, designed by Ivan Ivanov, who Abby just talked about, and there was no interest in hiding anything. It was all out for the Marsalas. It even had a dance floor like in Saturday Night Fever. So my disconnect around what architecture could actually do and this mentality around just designing houses continued into my second year until I had the rather confronting experience of a design studio where we were asked to design an office building using a structural grid that was informed by a car parking bay, and I could not believe it. I pulled out and I enrolled in interior design. So with this change of direction, and I'm the government architect, so I did it finish. I did a few stints in Sydney, and I didn't actually graduate from architecture until about 8 years later. And it was, in a way, the first of many experiences that I think illustrated to me as I was thinking about this, that kind of restlessness that I had in finding my place. But during that time, I had great, amazing mentors in Bill Busfield, Jeff Warne, Dick Donaldson, and Stephen Neal, who now lives in Sydney and is a practice director in Neeson Merkett Neal. It's also at uni where I got a taste for activism myself. This, as in Abby's, and there are quite a few overlaps, as I said, is Council House, which actually the time when we were at university was under threat of being demolished. And I remember Simon Pendle, who's shown here, his father was an MP at the time, and we were getting ready to be interviewed on radio, and his number one tip was to say, "That's a great question," and then just say whatever you wanted after that. My second stint in Sydney was supposed to be a semester, but turned in, because the first one was in a large practice. Leonie, I saw you here. That was with Leonie at Woods Bagot. And the second was with Neil Durbach's office, which at the time was called Neil Durbach Architects, but now Durbach Block Jaggers. And I made the most incredible friends in Camilla Block, Nick Murcutt, Rachel Neeson, Katie Molnar and Mariam Goucher, amongst others. It was a completely immersive and intense experience in the numbers of hours worked, in the relationships, and the belief in the power of a really excellent plan and beautiful architecture. And it was actually a complete departure from the education that I'd had up until this point, because there was no language around beauty. I'd never experienced that. But from the outset, Neil was really, really concerned about my limited knowledge of Corbusier. And to a lesser extent, Alto, and that's not because my knowledge was greater. Just for him, Alto was not as much of a concern as Corb, but still enough of a concern that he bought me a book on both. And they sat next to me as I made models, and he would come over and sit and critique the model, we'd discuss it, and then there'd be like a pop quiz. And I'd have to turn to a specific project which had been talked about previously. The first thing that happened when I returned to Perth to finish my studies is that I found myself a new bloke. His name is Kieran Wong, and he's now my husband. And the second that was, by the time I'd finished this second semester of fourth year, I was asked if I'd apply for a job as a lecturer, lecturing in interior design, but I still had my fifth year of architecture to go. So I didn't really think too much about it, and I applied for the job, I got it, and that really set that, that was like a fork in the road, I guess, because most people left at the end of architecture if they were serious about being an architect. They'd get experience somewhere else. But actually, I loved that job, and we ended up staying together, and it worked really well. Kieran and I have always been a really easy fit. We simultaneously threw all of our energy into building a practice, but also at the same time questioning the capacity of that to use our architectural skills to their greatest advantage. And we've walked a fine line from our young and carefree days of no responsibilities to our middle age with family and staff. To try and stay connected to the profession, but also agitate for change. We've used our problem-solving design thinking in the way that we've designed our practices that we set up to push forward, sideways, get knocked back, get back up. And we were impatient to move scales and away from residential architecture, which I think in this image is clear. We started with a pool with not much of an idea, and then we did a half an idea, and then we eventually had to get another architect to finish it off. In the year after graduating, we were invited to dinner by a couple that we hardly knew, to the home of a couple that they hardly knew in the hills overlooking Perth. And over the course of that meal, we decided that we'd set up a studio together. Kieran decided that it should be called the CODA, Central Office of Design and Architecture, which was really just making fun of the fact that no one thought anything happened in Perth, and it was sort of like a little nod to OMA. We decided that we would create our own energy, and we did. We collaborated with one another. Miriam and I, she's a fashion designer, we had a range of bags and luggage, and we had exhibitions and undertook graphic commissions. We did public art, and also the requisite couple of house renovations for family and friends. And at the end of 3 years, we just got to that point of expanding beyond our, friends and family client base, and we all decided actually the six of us needed to get on and think about what we wanted to do a little bit more seriously. So Kieran and I moved to Fremantle, taking the name of CODA and deciding that we'd focus on architecture. We bought an old butcher's shop and started renovating, and it's during this period that we also started our family. And I really saw a creative opportunity in designing a practice that aligned with our values at the same time as creating financial security. And it was really important to us that we commit to and engage with our community, and that has been a community of peers across Australia, a community of architects that we practice with locally, and also our local community in Fremantle. And the importance of our village has resonated with our kids, and our daughter Jemima, pictured here, is a councillor in the city of Fremantle, where she was elected just a couple of weeks after her 21st birthday. Part of the shift in practice required us to commit to thinking beyond the day-to-day and think strategically. We didn't want to do residential design, as you saw. We couldn't be trusted with that. So we needed to think of a way to kind of move and shift scales. And so having to listen to, I wanted to say business podcasts, but I realised they were actually CDs that I used to play in my car. I had this idea about starting an advisory board, which was based on this story I'd heard about this woman who was making dog tags from her apartment in Bondi, actually, weirdly. And I thought it was a translatable idea for us, because it would mean that Kieran and I could kind of get out of the day-to-day and really start to think a little bit more strategically about what we wanted to do. Being clear on our values attracted quite a lot of attention, but it also meant that we attracted and retained staff who knew what we were on about, and allowed us to create a really strong filter for our work. We continued to engage outside of our profession, to have fun, not take ourselves too seriously. But I also realised that I am a maker of things, and one of my friends, you have to be a certain age to get this joke, but one of my very close friends once referred to me as the thinking person's Tonya Todman. I don't know if anyone remembers her, but I was constantly had these craft activities on the go, and they turned into these annual gifts, which allowed us to maintain connections with people, to actually reflect and think about what it was that we'd achieved as a practice when you're often faced with so many disappointments and not very clear ends to projects, and allowed me to learn new skills. Actually, it was a complete joy. The scale of the work that we undertook in our practice as it grew also became larger and more disconnected from an object, but also started to think about what it was to, I guess, go back in those steps prior to set the scene where a good outcome is more likely. And that had its challenges, because a medium-sized practice trying to be a big practice in Perth isn't easy, and we realised that it wasn't sustainable. So in order to keep living our beautiful life in Fremantle, we realised that we needed to do something differently. So the transition from Coda, which was the first practice that we started, to the Fulcrum Agency was not smooth. In fact, it was probably one of the roughest periods of my life, and included a very short-lived merger. It also included the death of my father, being diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and the poor mental health of our son. So it was in this moment that I just put down my tools. I'm worse than you. Sorry, I'm going to get it together in a sec. And also, I felt really uncomfortable about being invisible. And I realised how much, during having Coda, the kind of sense of having a project published, or being asked to present at a conference, or winning an award, was actually much more of a part of my identity than I had wanted to admit. And I had to sit with that discomfort for a couple of years. And it was the greatest blessing, ultimately. Once I had made peace with that, it meant that we could create a practice that was really intentional and deliberate in both the way that the business was formed and the financial viability of it, but also it allowed us to completely move away from a a predisposition of thinking about creating objects and needing to have a larger practice that offers across every part of the delivery and really focus on becoming more and more expert. So we took all of the lessons of the previous 20 years and decided to really narrow our band of work, focus on staying small and becoming more expert and more useful. We wanted to pair our purpose, which was working with Aboriginal communities, with profit, but also find a way to demonstrate that we were not coming in as seagulls profiting from poverty. We established ourselves as a social enterprise, and 50% of our profits went back to our purpose. Kieran introduced me to the idea of radical incrementalism, and that meaningful change doesn't necessarily come from grand gestures, but from persistent, purposeful and small steps forward. And this was really, really valuable in our work with communities, but also took away the burden of feeling like we needed to solve the problem and to accept that even a small success is a move in the right direction. The Fulcrum Agency required all of our skills as architects to be deployed in different ways, and not calling ourselves architects was key to this. Working in community allowed us to develop a healthy respect for making something from what was at hand. It's not about the image, and there's no sexy photos. It's about bringing people together so that they can articulate what they need and what they want, and for them to understand the consequences of decisions that are being made. We're facilitators and synthesizers. And so I would say, in wrapping up, I took my mum overseas last year, and I took this photo when we were in a gallery in Madrid, but these are really depressing times. And I often wonder what I can really do to be useful when we think about the big issues. What can I do as an architect? But I also think that there are times that are well suited to the skill set that I have as an architect, and that my new role as the government architect has allowed me to create a strand that has connected my experiences and requires them to be deployed in different ways that are both visible and invisible. I actually don't see my skill set as exceptional. I think it's part of my DNA that comes from my education and my experience. But becoming invisible as a woman post-50, which is also another real invisible moment, and being invisible in the way that I work has been really liberating. And it's weird to have this visibility as a government architect, because a lot of what I do and the way that I'm useful is invisible, and I'm completely at peace with that. Thank you.
Thank you for taking us to your journey, which was beautiful. And I wonder, because your way that you work has changed, if you feel that right now what you do is the most fulfilling that you have done in your career, or what has been that gave you the most, or that feeling of that they were kind of...
I think it's been a surprise for me to feel the most at peace. That's the only real way I can, I had to make peace with the fact that it is difficult to make big change when you work in a big bureaucracy. And so being tactical, stealthy, if you like, about the ways that you can improve a situation or bring people together has required the use of many skills simultaneously, and that hasn't happened before. I guess I feel as though there's been lots of separate skills, and this is a moment where they're coming together. So in that regard, I feel that it is fulfilling. But I have equally had a great sense of pride around what we built up in the two practices that we started. So in those moments, they absolutely were, all-consuming.
And has the definition of success as an architect changed for you with the decades of work?
100%.
What would be your definition at the moment?
Well, I think for me, it's this. I think it comes from a place of wanting to broaden the definition of what architects do, and be able to really appreciate the contribution that occurs further, like before the, I'm sorry to be sitting here and having a sort of similar conversation as Abby, but there is a lot of crossover. I think there's so much work to be done in the setting up to make the terrain for a good project to happen. And that work, I think, for me, feels really important. And it takes many, many people, and it takes a kind of parking of the ego, because our profession tends to celebrate the creators of objects.
Yes.
And, I think that we can maybe be more generous. I don't want that to sound like I want people to celebrate me, but there's all these going into government. It's like there's another person and another, and I think, wow, these people are incredible. They're working and they understand the planning system, and they are able to connect dots in a way that if they didn't, we'd be in even more of a pickle, if you can believe that.
Many years ago in an interview, you said that people with a role like the government architects are for you heroes. And I wonder if you consider yourself a hero.
Did I say that?
You say, I give you the context.
I give you the context.
I give you the context. You say, I will always champion the role of people who take position in advocacy, such as government architects, government agencies, media, and councils. Celebrating that these people lay the groundwork for us architects.
Yeah, and I think that's probably...
Those people are heroes.
That's consistent with what I'm saying. I wouldn't call myself a hero. I think that's absolutely not possible to call me that. Apart from anything else, I haven't really done my job for long enough. So I need, you'll have to check in a few years. But for me, I guess it doesn't... I personally am not interested in being a hero. Mm-hmm. That's just not... I guess I find personal satisfaction in the work that I'm doing, and I don't need to be personally celebrated, but I think like government architects in general, and, as I said to my other network of government architects last year, a key KPI for me is there's still a government architect in Western Australia when I finish. So, keeping those roles alive is actually not always simple, because they are prone to, the whims of changes in the political climate. And I think we do need to make sure as a profession that we advocate for government architects. So I would prefer to answer that about government architects in general rather than me individually.
Yeah. One last one. You mentioned that your passion for activism, and also maybe connected to your mother that was so
fired up.
Fired up. Is it something that fires you up, that you will say, we'll have to work?
Don't get me started. You need another whole show. No. I think that to have an understanding of the value of design is fundamental, and I think that situations where there's a seeking out of loopholes, if you like, that kind of creates the lowest common denominator gets even lower, that drives me nuts. And, and I will go to great lengths. On one occasion, I really took on a very poor development, this is prior to this job, as in like a personal project. And one of my kids came home and said, "Mum, this is like CSI Fremantle." I had like drawings all over the kitchen, dining room, and I just was absolutely meticulously going through this process of demonstrating why this outcome was a disservice to the community, and managed to, build up a posse of draw people in, and we were successful in demonstrating that. But I think that, there's the consequences of the decisions that are made around the built environment last for generations. And I think, it is really important to me also that young people are included in those conversations. I don't think we can wait. And I think the older people, I have to include myself there, have demonstrated we haven't done an excellent job. So that inclusive way of taking responsibility for the impacts to the built environment, which are not fickle or short-lived, is so important to me.
You mentioned the importance of that the broad audience understand the importance of good design, not only among architects that might talk about architecture and design a lot. How would you explain good design to my mother, who is 76 and has not gone to the university, for example?
Well, I do this a lot, actually, because when I got my job, I realised that people, when I walked into a room, what people saw was a lot of complexity, budget blowout, time blowout. Nice to have, now's not the moment. That's more or less the vibe. So I created a little presentation at the beginning of any briefing that sort of said, I think this is what you think about when you think about an architect and design. I had a pretty stereotypical picture of an architect with a black texter, polo neck. And also an image from Grand Designs, which I think also reinforces that. And then talk about, in Western Australia, we've got a planning policy and it's got these 10 principles and starts off at context and character and finishes at aesthetics. So the very last thing you talk about is what something looks like, and there's all these other things around how it functions, and these are all design decisions. So really I think that it is possible to explain that design is in every decision that we make, and architects in the way that we work in the built environment don't come in and just make something look good. There's so much that goes into synthesising the complexity of a project. I would try and say that more simply to your mother, but not in Spanish.
If you will have to get in Spanish, if it has to be one, do you have a kind of a sentence that will say how? My mother will say, "Give it to me quick."
I don't think you can. I mean, I think your point is a good one. I think that we need to have clear and simple communication, but we can't have it to the extent that it's so simple that it dumbs something down. I think that design is complex, but we shouldn't use language that excludes people from engaging in that complexity. I think that would probably be my answer to you there. Like, I don't think we can talk about that in one, or I can't, maybe someone else can, but I can't.
I will think about it.
Yeah.
I will ask my mother. Emma, thank you for the beautiful talk and for the conversation. Later we'll have a roundtable discussion all together. Thank you from us. Thank you.